Hello. We are moving on in our stories of the Gospels. In our last session, it concluded with Jesus' famous words, "Before Abraham was born, I am." And so after that, they picked up stones to stone him. So he departed. He went out of the temple, going through the midst of them. Christ walked right through the crowd and no one stopped him. No one even tried. They just let him leave. Either their eyes were blinded or their hands tied. And so he left them to fume like a lion disappointed of its prey. These are some of the very clever words of Matthew Henry. God doesn't walk away from anyone unless they first push him away and want nothing to do with him. In Judges 16:20, it says that Samson did not know that the Lord, the Spirit of God, had departed from him. And so it was with these he calls them rebel Jews. God left them and they never missed him. Our next session is John chapter 9. And this segment contains the sixth of John's 7 signs. This incident occurred on a Sabbath day as Jesus and his disciples fled the temple and were walking through the streets of Jerusalem. Remember that this Sabbath was during the Feast of Tabernacles and made it a especially holy or high Sabbath. John 9:1 says, quote, "Now as Jesus passed by, he saw a man who was blind from birth." So even though the Jews had just treated Messiah terribly, insulting him with their words and actions, and provoking him in every way, he still didn't miss a chance to do them good. Even though Jesus was fleeing from a serious threat and trying to save his life, he still chose to stop and stay long enough to show mercy to this poor man. Some of the early commentators see this sign Jesus is going to do, this miracle, as a picture of the gospel going to the Gentiles. Hold on a minute, I'm trying to... Okay, where was I? Okay, so I have some kids out in the window and I'm shooing them away here from making a disruption. So some of the early commentators see this as a picture of the gospel going to the Gentiles, those who sat in darkness. The text says that he noticed him. That means he paid attention. Jesus paid attention to this man's situation and looked at him with genuine concern. This poor man could not see Jesus. And this is a picture of us Gentiles getting saved. Remember, keep that in mind. But Jesus saw him, and Jesus saw us, and anticipated both his prayers and expectations with a surprising cure. Jesus is often found of those that, quote, seek him not nor see him, and that's Isaiah 65:1, quote, "I was sought by those who did not ask for me. I was found by those who did not seek me. I said, here I am, to a nation that was not called by my name." If we truly understand anything about Jesus, it's because he already knows us and has taken hold of us. Galatians 4:9 says, "But now, after you have known God, or rather are known by God." When Jesus left the temple, his disciples went with him. They were the ones who'd stayed by him through all of his trials and followed him wherever he went. Now the apostles are going to seem to ask a very strange question, and that's John 9:2. Quote, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? However, their question, this is Dr. Fruchtenbaum's input, was not surprising because the Mosaic Law contains the principle that God visits, quote, the iniquity of the fathers upon the children, and upon the children's children, upon the third and upon the fourth generation. And that's Exodus 34:7. Conceivably, according to the Pharisaic law, the parents in this passage had committed a specific sin, and God had potentially visited that sin upon their son, causing him to be born blind? Well, Jesus is going to show them that no, that isn't the case. Well, the next part of the question is even more strange. When the apostles wondered if the man himself had sinned, how could the man have sinned in the womb before he was born blind? Well, again, the apostles' question reflects the Pharisaic Judaism of their day, and they were raised in that Pharisaic Judaism. According to this doctrine, a birth defect resulted from a specific sin committed either by the parents or the baby in utero. One rabbinic theory for birth defects was that God, in his sovereignty and omniscience, knew that the yet unborn baby would later commit a specific sin, which warranted the child being born blind. Hellenistic, that means Greek rabbinic documentary or commentary rather, describes a connection between unrighteousness and blindness. One kind of wild theory, but I'm going to share it with you. The theory of the rabbis included two inclinations, where from the time of conception, the fetus has two inclinations, either evil inclination or good. And during the 9-month period of development in the mother's womb, a struggle for control between the two inclinations occurs. And for most people, the good inclination prevails. Well, it's quite a kind of far out and left field idea, but to support this teaching, the rabbis referred to the story of Esau and Jacob, the twin brothers who were wrestling in their mother's womb. Well, Jesus is going to correct this Pharisaic error. The restoration of sight to someone who had gone blind at some point later in his life, either from injury or disease, had been done. It had been done before. The Pharisee, it's not unprecedented, in other words. The Pharisees had also been able to perform this miracle to some degree. Jewish writings give examples of this. And I know Nicodemus also is recorded as having done some miracles. A miracle or two, but just a few. However, being born blind was considered to be the result of divine judgment. That's a Pharisaic belief there, which is why people with birth defects were not allowed to recite the Shema, the special prayer. The rabbis believed those born blind would never be able to see until the Messiah came. Therefore, according to the theology of the rabbis, healing someone who was born blind was a messianic miracle. And this explains why things occurred the way they did in the passage. Now in John 9:3, Jesus is going to correct the faulty teaching of the Pharisees. Quote, neither this man nor his parents sinned, but that the works of God should be revealed in him. Well, this poor man was born blind and has continued this way to this day, in other words, so that now at last, the works of God should be made manifest through him and in him. God has full rights over his creation, and whether it is through what we do or what we endure, if it points back to his glory, it'll be well worth it. Our lives will have meaning. What we go through, these difficulties, will have a positive effect. But later rather than sooner, I'm sure. The hard things that happen under God's care may not make sense to us, but they can be understood this way. God allows them to reveal himself, to show his glory, and to share that we should also share in that glory to come. Well, this man was born blind that our Lord Jesus might have the honor of curing him and might prove himself sent of God. But a long time had passed since this man was born blind, and yet up until now, it had never been clear why that was. A note Matthew Henry makes here is that we don't often see what providence, that means God's foreknowledge, predetermined will for us, is really aiming at. Until long after things happen, sometimes years later. Now, moving on, John 9, 4-5, Jesus says, quote, I must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. The night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. Jesus here gives the reason for his taking initiative and his readiness to perform many works of healing, that he might do the works. Those are the works the Father had sent him to perform. And Jesus put his heart into doing that work. He wasn't doing it for show. It was a mission and not performance driven. The works Jesus had to do were, quote, works that were not only appointed by the Father, but done for the Father. He was a worker together with God. And now was his opportunity. I must work while it is day, while the time lasts, the time which is appointed for Jesus to work in, and while the light lasts, which is given in order to work. All the business of the mediatorial kingdom that Jesus inaugurated with the shedding of his blood like the Passover, the Lamb of God that was slain, that mediatorial kingdom was to be done within the limits of time and in this world. For at the end of the world, when time shall be no more, quote, the kingdom shall be delivered up to God, even the Father, and the mystery of God finished. That's 1 Corinthians 15:24. Secondly, all the work Jesus had to do had to be done by him personally while he was alive on earth. He had his window, his day, the season for action. And in a way, we do too here. The period of his opportunity was at hand, and therefore he would be busy. This incident provided another example of John's sub-theme of the conflict of light and darkness, because the night comes and no man can work. Well, Jesus's business in the world was to enlighten it. Jesus not only brings light for those who already see, but brings healing for those who can't. And Jesus will cure this blind man who is the representative of a blind world, because he came to be the light of the world, not only to give light, but we're going to soon see, to give sight. And we're going to see. In John 9:6, now when Jesus had said these things, meaning after he had given this instruction to his disciples about the correct understanding Jesus now prepares an eye salve. 9:6, John 9:6, quote, he spat on the ground and he made clay with the saliva. He anointed the eyes of the blind man with the clay. The clay was made from his own saliva, perhaps because maybe there was no water near, perhaps, we don't know for sure. Or it can just demonstrate that there is healing virtue in everything that belongs to the Messiah. Well, he spread the clay upon the eyes of the blind man. Like a gentle physician, he did it himself with his own hand, though the patient was a lowly beggar. Jesus did this to magnify his power in making a blind man see by a method which you might think is more likely to make a seeing man blind. Placing clay on the eyes would close them, would pack them in, but would never open them. Well, note the power of God often works in ways that look opposite of what we'd expect or want. Keep that in mind, right? It was his mighty hand, the very same hands that molded the first Adam out of clay. For by him, Jesus, God made the worlds. That's Colossians 1:16. And John 1:3 says, for in him, in Jesus, all things were created. Man was formed out of the clay, and here Messiah used the same materials to give sight to the body. In Acts 26, verses 13 to 18, is the testimony of the Apostle Paul, and God is speaking to him during his conversion on the way to Damascus. Quote, now, this is Jesus saying to Paul, for I have appeared to you for this purpose. I now send you to the Gentiles to open their eyes in order to turn them from darkness to light, thank God, and from the power of Satan to God, that they may receive forgiveness of sins and an inheritance among those who are sanctified by faith in me. Paul in his conversion was struck blind for 3 days, and then the scales fell from his eyes. Well, here the method Jesus uses looks quite weak and unlikely, but nevertheless, the power behind it is what actually makes it effective. Now, Jesus tells the man in John 9:7, quote, go wash in the pool of Siloam, which is translated sent. So the blind man was being tested to see if he would obey in simple trust, even when the command came from someone he hardly knew. Whether he was going to go along with the strict tradition of the Pharisees, which said you couldn't do such a thing as washing on the Sabbath, much less washing in the pool of Siloam, even for healing. Or would he trust Jesus and obey? Healing is ultimately brought about by Messiah's power and grace, but here Jesus' method requires that the blind man has a duty to perform and participates in his healing, in other words, an act of obedience, to go wash. Well, the waters of the pool of Siloam came from Mount Zion, so these were waters of the sanctuary, Psalm 46:4. The waters of Siloam had from ancient times signified the throne and kingdom of the house of David and pointed to the Messiah. The Apostle John will take notice of the significance of the name Siloam because he said this, it is being interpreted means sent. While the Messiah is also known as, quote, the sent one. Dr. Fruchtenbaum comments that the procedure the Messiah used to heal this man raises a question. Why would Jesus go to all the trouble of spitting, making mud, smearing it on the man's eyes, and sending him to the pool? After all, He had instantly healed blind people, raised people from the dead, etc. Why not this time? Well, the first thing to note is that this miracle happened on a high Sabbath day. The healing Jesus performed involved many different breaches of the Sabbath law. The first one of these, that he had made clay that was considered work, too much work. You don't work on the Sabbath. Next, it would be a question of whether any remedy might be applied on the holy day, the holy high Sabbath. Such could only be done in diseases of the internal organs, and specifically from the throat downwards, except when there was a danger to life or loss of an organ involved. Now, as to regards of the saliva, there was ancient belief that there was healing, saliva was healing in and of itself, right? But they forbade, as it was a law, that you don't put saliva in somebody's eyes on the Sabbath for healing. You don't do that either. And that was based on the ground that it wasn't evidently intended as a remedy, and it's not to be done. By healing the man on a Sabbath day and in a manner that presented a clear provocation to Pharisaic Judaism, Jesus once again goes out of his way to break the Mishnaic law while faithfully keeping the law of Moses. So the blind man went his way, and for him to obey Jesus and to go to the pool was an act of faith, important in receiving that miracle. The pool of Siloam was not easily accessible from the main part of Jerusalem. The man had to walk down a very steep hill to the lowest part of the city of David, and that's a difficult task for those with sight, but even more difficult for those who were blind. Why did he send him to that pool and not another one? Well, earlier Jesus responded to the kindling of the lampstands during the Feast of Tabernacles by saying that he was a representative of that lampstand. I am the light of the world, he said in John 9:5. And now this pool of Siloam, which was used during the Feast of Tabernacles every day during that week for the ordinance of the drawing of the and pouring of the water during that feast. So the pool of Siloam was represented that ordinance. And also the pool was conveniently the most crowded water source in Jerusalem during this occasion. And from there, word would spread very quickly that another messianic miracle had been performed. So when the clay was washed off from his eyes, all the other barriers were removed with it. The man saw for the first time in his life. Boy, my goodness. Even the best eye surgeon with the finest tools and steadiest hands couldn't fix what Messiah healed instantly. No doubt, this is he that should come into the world. The man who was healed came back from the pool to his neighbors and acquaintances, wondering and being wondered at by them. Nevertheless, Jesus, in keeping with his policy of silence, he demanded personal faith and only responded to individual personal needs. Jesus had removed himself from the public eye when the miracle took place. And since so many of the witnesses to the miracle knew this man, it was just well planned by God's providence that this blind man, he's a common beggar, and was generally well known throughout the city so that many people could testify to the truth of the miracles. Going on in John 9:8, there was confusion that arose because many people recognized him as the same blind beggar. They would say, yes, he's the beggar, he is. But others had difficulty believing that a man born blind was healed, and they said, no, he just looks like him. And finally, the man settled the controversy himself and said, I am he. I am he. Well, theologically, the people could not reconcile what had just happened. Something good, a wonderful miracle which only the Messiah could perform, had occurred. However, he had healed a man on the Sabbath day in the way that Pharisaic Judaism forbids. So these people, the friends and acquaintances and relatives, perhaps take this now seeing a beggar to the Pharisees for an explanation. And John 9:10 going on, it says, quote, therefore they said to him, and these are the people around him at the pool, and his neighbors say, how were your eyes opened? And in verse 11, he responds, a man called Jesus made clay and anointed my eyes and said to me, go to the pool of Siloam and wash. So I went and washed, and I received sight. In John 9:12, then they said to him, where is he? He said, I don't know. Well, this poor man gives them a very plain and full account of the matter. And they ask, well, where is he? Where is he, this miracle worker? Well, we hope, ask this question out of good intentions. And here, where is he that we can be acquainted with him? Where is he that we may come to him? But others might have, out of ill will, thought, where is he that they may seize him? The next section now we have the first interrogation of the man by the Pharisees, because this was an unusual miracle. It required their investigation and explanation. Now in John 9:13-14, they brought him who formerly was blind to the Pharisees. Now it was the Sabbath on the day when Jesus made the clay and opened his eyes. Then again, the Pharisees also asked him again how he had received his sight. He said to them, he put clay on my eyes, and I washed, and I see. Well, they continue the interrogation in John 9:16. Therefore, some of the Pharisees said, this man is not from God, because he does not keep the Sabbath. Others said, how can a man who is a sinner do such things? And there was a division among them. Notice that the emphasis was not upon signs, but upon, quote, such signs, such a sign as this, meaning this particular sign, that were unprecedented. When the religious leaders asked the man for his opinion regarding the one who had healed him, he simply concluded that Jesus must be a prophet. Well, he must be a prophet, he said. However, though a prophet might be able to perform miracles, as Elijah and Elisha certainly did, to perform a messianic miracle was not the prerogative of a prophet, but rather the prerogative of the Messiah alone. Well, so this first interrogation of the man did not lead to any specific conclusions. So now in John 9:18-23, since the result of their first interrogation of the man was inconclusive, the Pharisees, doubting he was really born blind, asked his parents to confirm it. John 9:18 says, quote, but the Jews did not believe concerning him that he had been blind and received sight, until they called the parents of him who had received his sight. And responding to their questions, the parents confirmed two things. One, this man was definitely their son, and two, that he really was born blind. And that's in John 9, chapter 9, verse 19. So the parents answered them and said, quote, we know that this is our son, and that he was born blind, but by what means he now sees, we do not know. Or who opened his eyes, we do not know. He's of age. Ask him. He's going to speak for himself. Well, the reason for their reluctance is given in the next verse, 9:22 of John. Quote, his parents said these things because they feared the Jews, for the Jews, meaning the Jewish leadership, had already agreed that if anyone confessed that Jesus was the Messiah, he would be put out of the synagogue. And so Jesus, the Jewish believers in Jesus were threatened as well, not just with a rebuke of temporary exclusion, but with permanent excommunication. Well, so now the interrogation of the parents also ended inconclusively. During the next interrogation is the second interrogation of the man born blind. And now the Pharisees, you're going to notice, are beginning to lose their temper. In John 9:24-34. Quote, 9:24 says, so they again called the man who was blind and said to him, give God the glory. We know that this man is a sinner. Well, knowing that someone is a sinner is not a reason to praise God and give God glory. But the Pharisees were so beside themselves over Jesus that they were no longer able to think rationally and clearly and logically. At this point, the man, healed of his blindness, said very tactfully in John 9:25, whether he is a sinner or not, I do not know. One thing I do know, that though I was blind, I now see. Well, this man's response is subtle and tactful, but it was not simply a statement of fact. It was a challenge to the Pharisees to explain. They had to answer to him about this. What's going on? Well, he was born blind, not merely had gone blind later in life. And the Pharisees had taught him that only the Messiah could heal someone blind from birth. According to their own theology, Jesus should be declared Israel's Messiah then and there. Instead, they called him a sinner. So could they please explain why? Well, the Pharisees took up the challenge and asked the question in 9:26. What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? Well, the man had already explained, probably more than once. So the man responds this way, I already told you, but you did not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you also want to become his disciples? At this point, the man was no longer being tactful. Now they're going to reply in like manner, saying in John 9:28 and 29, quote, they reviled him and said, you are his disciple, but we are Moses' disciples. We know that God spoke to Moses. As for this fellow, we don't know where he is from. Well, the Pharisees realized they could not persuade him to accept their verdict, so they gave up on him. At this response, the man born blind now is going to let them have it. He lost all tact and said in John 9:30-32, quote, why, this is a marvelous thing that you do not know where he's from, yet he has opened my eyes. Now we know that God does not hear sinners. He had good theology, this man. But if anyone is a worshiper of God and does his will, he hears him. Since the world began, this man says, it has been unheard of that anyone opened the eyes of one who was born blind. Oh my God. Well, the Pharisees really had no grounds for rejecting Jesus as the Messiah, but they're going to respond again. Quote, if this man were not from God, this is the formerly blind man is saying this to them in 9:33. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. Well, now the Pharisees respond to him, quote, 9:34, You were altogether born in sins, and do you teach us? According to their theology, he had been born with a disability because of a specific sin. As someone altogether born in sins, he could never teach them anything. And their final act was to cast him out, to put him out of the synagogue permanently. He was excommunicated. And now, going forward, we're going to find the man is now going to be spiritually healed. He had been physically healed. Now comes his spiritual healing, which is an important moment. And that's John 9:35 to 41. And we'll try to finish this pretty quickly. Well, the man had never actually seen Jesus up to this point, and when he had walked away from him, he was still blind. Well, in John 9:35, quote, Jesus heard that they had cast him out. News like that would have spread through the whole city, and everyone was probably talking about it, saying how wrong it was. 9:36, and when he had found him, which implies Jesus went looking for the man so he could encourage him and give him comfort. Jesus likely had heard that the man had spoken so very well, so bravely, so boldly in his defense. Just note this, that our Lord Jesus notices and remembers every true stand we make for him. God keeps a record like a book of remembrance. And that will not only count for us in the future, but bring us strength and comfort now. Here was a poor man suffering for Christ, and Christ made sure that as his sufferings increased, his consolations and comforts would overflow even more. Now Jesus is going to examine his faith. Quote in 9:35, do you believe in the Son of God? Well, Jesus, in calling himself Son of God, is showing us that his kingdom is spiritual and divine. The man asked, quote, who is he, Lord, that I may believe in him? And Jesus graciously reveals himself to him, quote, you have both seen him, and it is he who is talking with you. And as far as we know, there are only two occasions where Jesus plainly reveals himself as the Messiah, here to this man and to the Samaritan woman. It seems as if he chooses the outsiders and the overlooked and outcast to receive the plainest revelation. And the man says, Lord, I believe, and he worshiped him. Luke 2:30 says, quote, for my eyes have seen your salvation. He professed his faith in Jesus Christ. Lord, I believe you to be the Son of God. Believing with the heart, he confesses with the mouth, and he paid him honor more than respect that a great man would receive. He worshiped him. It was divine worship as the Son of God come in the flesh. God alone is to be worshiped. So when he worshiped Jesus, he acknowledged that Jesus is God. And for one Jew to worship another Jew meant he understood him to be the Messianic God-man. Thank you so much. I'm going to stop right here, but continue on with the next part of this important miracle that happened. Thank you. God bless you.